So getting into this Scott Thornberry book, which unfortunately is a little bit old, but there's nothing new that we can find that's really good to replace it. It's just kind of tried and true and faithful and good, and there hasn't been a lot new produced, neither for teaching listening and speaking nor for teaching reading. So it's kind of hard to find a new textbook, but I'm not unhappy with this one at all. I like it, but we usually try and use textbooks that are no more than 5 years old, but there's just not much published, I think, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to do a new edition. So just take that with a grain of salt. That usually doesn't happen, but in some cases you have a classic, or the field hasn't changed much, so there's no need to make people buy a new book for no reason. So I have a few questions incorporated into the PowerPoint here. So just to kind of get the ball rolling, what do you think about how would you say you can help your students to become more fluent? And after all, what is fluency? Does fluency mean good pronunciation, or does it mean something else?
To me, fluency, I've always thought of it as automatically speaking,
right,
rather than having to think over or have the translating it from language 1 to language 2. That's what fluency has always meant to me. But reading through this article, fluency encompasses so much more. So with my students, yes, pronunciation is important, but I think fluency means being able to, speak to somebody without all the pauses and the stopping, and becoming more automatic, and thinking through, more quickly without the pauses that come with learning a second language.
Okay, so it kind of has to do with speed and rhythm.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, good. And so what do you do to try and help your students to become more fluent?
So since I work with children who are generally 3 to 5, so they're much younger, I try to, if they're understanding the pronunciation in the material, to not go so slow, but to kind of speak at a more natural rhythm, which I've been trying to do lately. And I find that really helps with their speaking and their fluency and their understanding. They're picking up those chunks and those words a lot quicker. Because mainly we focus on the ABCs and phonemes and the basic building blocks. So trying to teach them phrases such as, how are you? What's your name? How are you doing? And speaking more quickly. And they're picking that up as well.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Great. So you're at the very beginning stages of that. So
very beginning.
Yeah, we might even argue that you're maybe a little bit pre-fluency just because of the amount of speaking that they can do. Right, but setting the pace for that, right? Setting the groundwork for that to come along, right? Their natural talents. Great. Okay. So these are a list of what good speakers can do. So we think of them as having production. They can conceptualize and formulate ideas. They can articulate their ideas. That means that they have the vocabulary to be able to express their ideas. They know when they're not making sense, or some of that is by the interlocutor's physiological responses. If you see somebody has a confused face, but they can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So they're speaking and they can attend to the conversation and notice when they themselves make a mistake or you're not understanding, so they can rephrase or repair or say it in another way. And you mentioned this sense of automaticity where things just kind of flow, and I think that's where the word fluency comes from, because it sounds like a flow, like water, like it doesn't stop, it's not choppy. And then they can also contribute to managing talk. So they manage the conversation. You can come up with new ideas. You can ask questions. You can build off of what somebody else has said. So you can actually contribute to making the conversation itself fluent. So not just you as an individual speaker, but the interaction between yourself and the interlocutor also might be more fluent if you're a more fluent speaker. So you can use some of those strategies, the speaking strategies, to make your conversation more fluent. So production is, according to Thornberry, considered linear. It takes place in real time. An utterance is the equivalent of a sentence. However, it's not necessarily a grammatical sentence, like when you write, where you need a subject, verb, a period. We frequently speak in words or phrases in conversation, and that's part of what makes listening and speaking a more difficult skill than reading or writing, because not all of the required information is always there. And there are a lot of assumptions made that, especially by native speakers, that the other person will understand. So you might say something like, really? And that's an utterance. So an utterance is usually a turn when you're in conversation. So an utterance could be a dialogue, not a dialogue because that's two people, but it could be your part in the dialogue. So it might be several sentences, or it might just be one word, or it might be an incomplete sentence. So an utterance is like our chunk of speech or a chunk of language in oral production as opposed to written production. So we talked a little bit about engaging the interlocutor before, and the production tends to be spontaneous. It's contingent upon the previous utterance. So that's obviously how conversation works. Is a good conversation anyway, is if your interlocutor is listening, you're going to build upon what the other person just said and add a point of view or an idea or a comment or a counter position. And so it's not pre-planned. We don't have guidance of how it's going to go, whereas when in a piece of writing it may evolve that way, where maybe we don't know where it's going to go, but then once it's kind of set in stone, then it is predetermined, right? So you have this naturality to speaking. And then the turn taking is the other clear facet of oral communication that's an important component of speaking. And you usually don't have that in written communication, unless of course it's a dialogue or a play or something like that, or for some reason there's a dialogue that's been written where there's turn taking. But in general, that's not what occurs with writing, but it's an important part of speaking. And there have been a lot of very interesting studies done about turn taking. There's a whole field of study that is called conversation analysis that looks into Why do people give up their turn? When do they stop? How do you hold the ground when you want to keep your turn? Because if you're speaking with somebody who is dominant or aggressive, or or rude, or doesn't care about your opinion, or for whatever reason they want to interpose and impose their point of view, then so there's a really interesting studies, and it has a lot to do with personality and confidence and gender in terms of how people take turns. So when you have a conversation between two women, it tends to be a lot more harmonious in terms of listening and taking turns. And when it's a male-female pair, you do see some differences in the speaking styles and listening. And then there's a physical aspect too of eye contact and gaze and looking down or raising your hand. And then there's also the ESL component. So we tend to see also that people, when they're speaking in their second language, in general, this is a generalization, but sometimes they feel less confident. So they're less likely to take the floor and hold the floor. And of course, it depends on the context. And if they're in a group of non-native speakers, then that's different than if it's one non-native speaker in a group of native speakers. And then, of course, there are the personality variables in the situation. Like if it's an emergency, then people's shyness tends to go out the window. So there's a lot of factors to look at in turn taking, but it's a very interesting study. So then we talk a little bit about, we'll go into detail into some of these topics a little bit. So looking deeper into conceptualization and formulation. So the conceptualization, do you want to talk a little bit about conceptualization? What did you gather about that from the reading?
Sure, definitely. So what I gathered is it starts in two steps. First with formulation. So the speaker is making these strategic choices about their vocabulary, the way the sentences are formed, how the discourse is going to play out. And then the second stage is conceptualizing the story. So picking the topic, your purpose for speaking, the discourse type. Yes.
Okay, all right, awesome. So based on the discourse type, then that's going to predetermine to some extent the type of syntax that you'll use. So if you're in a very formal setting, if you're making a speech, if you're giving a lecture, or if you're doing an interview or something, you might use more formal language that has certain syntactical structures where you tend to see the longer sentences, more transition words as connectors. So they're using transition words as opposed to coordinating conjunctions. They tend to use more sophisticated vocabulary. Even the intonation and stress and tone can be different according to the context, which helps to determine the conceptualization and the formulation of the topic. This happens in kind of a chunking sequence. So as we said before, people don't usually plan out the whole topic unless it is a very formal context. If it's a dialogue, there's more ebb and flow, but it does kind of tend to occur in chunks. And you probably even noticed that looking back at your own conversations, right? You'll stay on one topic for a while and then switch to another topic. So these are kind of chunks that build upon each other. And that's kind of how we characterize good conversation too. It's like you'll discuss a topic until it's no longer interesting or relevant, and then there will be some idea that will send you off into something else. So talking a little bit more about articulation. So for articulation, It follows a formation, and it's the use of speech organs to produce sound. So when we're going to start to get into pronunciation very soon. And so when we talk about this, what is the fancy word for the study of pronunciation?
Oh.
So we just talked about syntax a moment ago, and syntax is the fancy word for studying grammar or sentence structure. So what's the fancy word for pronunciation? We're going to start looking at the IPA alphabet. And what does that stand for? IPA. Have you run across that yet? Okay, that's fine. You're not, that this is kind of like preview. We'll get into that actually next week. So IPA means the International Phonetic Alphabet. So it's those symbols that look like letters that help us to pronounce a word that a dictionary will show us how to pronounce. So phonetics is the study of speech sounds. And phonology is usually a little bit more complex than that. It looks at words in context. So you might have like how the stress and intonation and how words are connected together, like in liaisons where you speak rapidly and words flow. So that has to do with fluency, right? Is when our words connect, when they flow together, that's how it doesn't sound choppy and sounds more native-like. I think there's a high correlation between fluency and the word sounding native-like. Obviously, second language learners can certainly be fluent, but there's this connotation that you sound more native-like. So inside the field of phonetics, we have three different areas. We have articulatory phonetics, which is how the body and the speech organs produce sound. So the tongue, the lips, the roof of the mouth, the teeth, the throat, and so it's about speech production. So articulation is about speech production. And then there's another field called acoustic phonetics, and that's really the physics of how sound waves travel through the air. So our voices are different at different pitches. Like women generally have a higher pitched voice than men. And that's due in part to two things. It's partially due to articulatory phonetics, because the vocal folds in the throat that touch each other when we make a vibratory sound in our vocal tract. For women, they tend to be tighter and longer and thinner. So that's why women have higher voices generally than men. And men have thicker vocal folds, which causes them to have a deeper voice. That's one of the reasons. It also has to do with lung capacity and diaphragm and body weight. But this physiological phenomenon also affects the acoustic phonetics. So the way the sound is pronounced, it's already produced at a higher pitched, and so then therefore it's going to travel through the airwaves at a higher frequency. And lower pitched sounds have a lower frequency. And then there's the other type of phonetics is where we perceive the sounds. So once again, it's physiological. It's in our ear and in our brain. So we have neurological pathways that allow us to perceive sound. And I told this story the other night in my 660 class on campus. So I have several students in in the listening and speaking, so they're going to hear this story twice if they listen to this video. But all healthy babies, when they're born, have the ability to hear and produce all of the sounds in all of the languages, if the baby is healthy. They have the physiological potentiality for perceiving as well as producing all of the speech sounds. There are hundreds of speech sounds if you think of all the languages in the world. English uses a section of those, you know, and other languages use different sections. There's overlap, but not all languages use all the sounds. However, with time, as babies are exposed to certain languages, maybe they grow up in a household that's multilingual and they're exposed to several languages, or if they're raised in a monolingual household and they're only exposed to one language, they lose the ability to perceive the speech sounds in other languages because they were not exposed to it. So physiologically, they had that potentiality. But since those neurological connections were not created because they were not exposed to it, then they no longer have that possibility. And likewise, the same thing occurs with speech sounds. So we're physiologically able to make all the sounds that possibly exist through our anatomy, but with time, we lose the capacity to make those sounds. And so for anybody who has studied another language, and when you're studying Vietnamese or something like that, you struggle with how do I make these tones and these nasal sounds that we don't have in English because I've never done it before. It feels awkward, and it's like lifting weights or something. You have to develop the muscles, and you can feel it when you learn a language like German and you have to use your throat and you're not accustomed to it, and it's actually tiring when you're using your throat to make guttural sounds that you're not accustomed to. So this is what makes pronunciation in a second language difficult, particularly for adults, because they have lost that ability a long time ago. So it makes it more difficult for them to recuperate. It's not impossible, though, however. With multiple repetitions, you can actually create new neural pathways and the ability to perceive the distinction in subtle sound differences that you can't perceive as a beginner adult learner of a second language. So with repeated exposure, you can perceive it, and once you can perceive it, then you can articulate it with precision. So it might not be perfect, but it will certainly be better. So the point here is that it takes a lot of repetition to be able to recuperate that ability. Merely being exposed to it a handful of times was not sufficient. So I think that's very important for us as language teachers to keep in mind with our students, that repetition is really important. And so maybe we don't have time for that in the classroom because there's so much content that we have to study and we're responsible for discussing, but students need to find other opportunities to get that practice outside of class. So if it's listening to some kind of audio where they're getting repetition, where they listen to that sound, so some kind of a recording. That's why language labs were so prevalent in the 70s, 80s, 90s, because we focused a lot on the audiolingual method that focused a lot on pronunciation. And so they did a lot of listening and repetition. So English has 40 phonemes, and phonemes are sounds. So it's one speech sound. That's the unit of sound, is a phoneme. So we have something like, for example, we have something called minimal pairs. That's if you have two words that are almost exactly alike, except for they change one phoneme, it changes the sound, the meaning of the word by changing one sound. So you have something like the difference between pin and bin. Right? So PIN versus BIN in graphemes, letters, right? But it just so happens P and B, the P sound, the letter P symbol, it represents the P sound, and the B letter represents the B sound. But the difference is P has just a puff of air, whereas B has vibration in the vocal tract, right? So just changing that one phoneme changes meaning. So a phoneme actually has potential for meaning. Like in and of itself, it's a sound, but when you put it together in context, it can change the meaning of the word. So in English, we have vowels and consonants, obviously. But when we start to look at this from a phonetic standpoint, there's an interesting distinction between vowels and consonants. Do you know what that is?
Between vowels and consonants, phonetically?
Yeah.
I know I had it here. One moment. I know it's with there's a difference in articulation and
There is.
production in the way that your mouth forms. I don't remember the specific difference.
Right, that's exactly it. With vowels, there's no point of articulation. What that means is that none of the apparatus in our vocal tract touch each other. So for a point of articulation, that's when two things touch. So you might have a bilabial sound, the example I just gave you with p and b. Both of those are bilabials because our two lips touch. So we know that that's a consonant because there's a point of articulation. There's a place where two articulators touch, and that's where the sound occurs. If we take the example t, t, or d, d, that it has a different point of articulation. That's a labial, no, that's a lingual dental, so that the tongue touches the teeth. And so whenever something touches, it's a consonant. If it doesn't touch, it's a vowel. So the vowel sounds are caused by a change in the shape of our mouth, basically. So it's a change in the height of the jaw, if your mouth is very open or closed, the lips, if they're spread or rounded, right? If the mouth is open or closed. The height of the tongue. So the tongue moves inside the mouth, and it might be in high position, but it's not touching the back of the teeth like it does with t, you know? So if you have like a, if we go through the vowels, a, e, o, u, you can feel how your tongue goes up and your lips start to round. A, e, o, u, right? But they don't actually touch. Your tongue is moving inside there and getting closer and closer, and maybe it kind of touches on the roof of your mouth, but that's not where the sound occurs. It doesn't occur in ooh, ooh, right? The back of your tongue kind of touches the sides of the roof of your mouth, but the sound is actually just flowing straight through. It's not occurring where the tongue touches. So this is the difference in terms of phonetics, is the difference between a vowel and a consonant. Now, if we're talking about spelling, the definition's a little bit different. I don't want to go into that yet. We'll get into that later, but this is the phonetic difference.
Oh, sorry, I'm not seeing the articulation PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah. You're not? Really? Your screen sharing is paused. Why did that happen? Oh.
Let's see.
Interesting. I see. Yeah, hang on. Let's see what. Oh, did that work? No? Okay, let's just try again. Do you see it now?
Oh, I see your mouse moving, yeah.
Do you see the PowerPoint? No, not at all. You just see the mouse?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me stop sharing. Well, let's try it again. Can you see it now?
Just your mouse.
Oh, dang. That's really strange. Not sure what to do here.
Is there anything on my end
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah, let me try.
Sure.
Do you see it now?
There we go. Yes.
Now you see it? Awesome. Okay, yay. Great. Okay, good. All right. So articulation affects the words in the neighborhood. So the word that comes before or after. Sometimes the pronunciation of the letter might change due to the environment in which the word occurs. So for example, we have the example handbag. We don't really pronounce it very clearly and say, oh, get my handbag, please, right? You'll say, grab my handbag, would you please, right? Grab my
Yeah.
handbag. So this d, b, right? The d actually turns into a because of the environment. So let's analyze this for a second and try and guess why. So we talked about b as being a bilabial, right? Your two lips touch to produce b in bag. And the position for d, where's the position for that? Your tongue touches
The roof of your
the roof of
mouth.
your mouth.
Your teeth. Yeah.
Exactly. That area is called the alveolar ridge. It's the alveolar ridge just behind your teeth. And so your tongue touches just behind your teeth. So it's alveolar is the point of articulation. So it's a little hard for your tongue to be touching there and then to go to a bilabial, to go from d, b. So what we do is we anticipate the b by turning the d into a which is also, where's the point of articulation for
That's right behind your lips, coming from
What's touching when you say
lips.
Yep,
Your lips are touching. Yeah.
two lips. Therefore, it's
Yeah.
called, what's it called?
Bilabial.
Bilabial. Bi means two, labial means lips. So two lips. So the point of articulation is bilabial. So this is what we call anticipatory articulation, where our mouth is getting ready to make the b. So we're lazy and we want to do it fast to be fluent. So we make it a instead of a d. So we understand through the context when you say, honey, would you please grab my handbag? Right? You don't even hear it. But right, so the phonemes might change, the articulation might change, the expression of the word might change based on the environment. So this is a tricky thing for language learners, right? They want to say it the way it's written, the way that they see it. So they see handbag, and then this is what causes people to have an accent or to not be as fluent as they might want to be because they're attached to the spelling as opposed to how it's actually produced in rapid speech.
I've encountered that a lot in my courses as well. So they focus so strongly on the correct pronunciation of words. But when I'm speaking faster to a student, I make those mistakes and blend the words together. So I'm not sure if to correct myself or to have them repeat after me because it sounds more natural in what they'll encounter in real life.
Most people would say that you should go with the natural, that you should speak naturally and allow your students to hear you speak naturally, because you're the one and probably very few opportunities that they get to speak to a native speaker and to have that interaction, so that they will probably be more fluent and have more natural sounding pronunciation if they had that opportunity to be exposed to you. However, there's a phenomenon that's called teacherese, which is, can you guess what that means?
Teacherese.
Okay, so let me
Maybe copying the teacher?
Well,
or
so
mirroring the teacher?
it's the way that the teacher speaks. Let me give you another example and then see if you can figure it out. There's another word called motherese. And motherese is the way that mothers speak to babies. And what do they do?
Very much baby talk or pausing in between words. So maybe teachers, maybe over pronunciation of words
Exactly.
and slowing down too much.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So teacherese is a tend to use very careful articulation that can be somewhat stilted and artificial and unnatural. But we do it in an attempt to be more intelligible so that our students can understand us. So we're trying to digest it and give it to them in smaller, more understandable chunks. So it depends is the answer on a lot of things. So it depends on the age of your learners, and it depends on their proficiency level. If students are more advanced, then we would hope that you would speak to them more naturally. With beginners and with young learners, we can make, well, maybe not with young learners, but certainly with beginners, we might make the argument that you might want to use a little bit of teacherese, just to be very clear so that they understand, so that they get that sensation that they're understanding you speak, and that builds confidence. And so then they can try and they can speak, and then you get into that back and forth of the conversation and dialogue that we discussed a minute ago, which is very rewarding and fulfilling for students. So there are pros and cons. I think if you use it all the time, then eventually you will be doing a disservice to your students. But there are certain or types of students that I would use it with, and I think there's no harm, no foul.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Let's else who joined us. Hi, how you in? Welcome. Okay, so let's go down to the next slide. All right, so looking deeper at self-monitoring and repair. So self-monitoring is that metacognition of ourselves as a speaker in another language, or even in our L1, we do this too. So we kind of monitor our speech as it comes out. And sometimes at the planning stage, and we do this even in our L1, maybe you're rehearsing in your head what you want to say to somebody. We do this a lot when we're in an argument with somebody and we want to tell them our point of view, and we rehearse in our mind what we want to say. So this is the planning stage where you're kind of thinking about what you're going to say. But we also monitor ourselves when we're speaking in another language. So sometimes we're wondering if we have the right vocabulary item. There tends to be a bit more planning when you're speaking in another language, particularly if you're not at advanced levels yet. So people are kind of searching for vocabulary items or sentence structure as they're speaking. And as you become more fluent, you don't need to do that as much. So therefore, that's kind of why the fluency occurs, because there's less monitoring. You're able to just let it go more automatically. But these are conversation repair strategies, regardless of whether it's your L1 or your L2. So you might need to slow down if you see that the other person doesn't understand. You might need to backtrack and reiterate or repeat or say something in a different way to make it clear if you can tell from your interlocutor that they didn't understand. But these running self-repairs are little micro adjustments that we make all the time to our speech. And we're usually not even very conscious of it because we're focusing more on the topic than on the how. However, when you're speaking in another language, then we tend to focus a little bit more on the how until you get to very proficient levels. So looking a little bit deeper at automaticity and fluency, does this bar at the bottom get in your way? Can you see that or not? My
Nope.
bar? Nope. Okay, awesome. Great. I'm actually going to move it up to the top because it's in my way. Okay, great. So the automaticity, then when you get to that point where you are more automatic and more fluent, then you can start to focus more on your attention more on the topic, on the content itself, and you make the repairs more rapidly. It just happens more automatically. You don't have to kind of think about the word. And I don't know about you, but this happens to me even in English, because when I speak a lot of other languages, sometimes I start to forget the vocabulary in English. So automaticity happens even in your L1, where you get to that point where you
That's happened. Searching for the information.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. So some strategies to work with this is memorizing prefabricated chunks of language. And this is really interesting because this has to do with some methods of language teaching. Like, for example, there are methods that focus on these chunks of language. So as opposed to teaching individual vocabulary words, they'll teach chunks like phrases like about these are our specials today. What would you like to would you like cream or coffee? Would you like cream and sugar with that? You know, so like there's set phrases that we use in particular contexts, or when you go to the post office. So maybe you've had this experience in another language. I've had this frequently, where you're there and you don't have a clue what they're saying, but they put the credit card machine in front of you, so you understand, okay, now it's time to pay, right? So there's some
Yeah.
dialogue going on
Physical
there.
contact. Yeah.
Right, yeah,
All
so
the
you know,
time.
you know what's expected, right? You go to the post office to buy some stamps, and you know, you get the word stamps out, and she shows you a book or a sheet. You can, you're right, so you can make these choices, and it happens. But so there's a whole school of language teaching that works around teaching these chunks of language, and it's very useful for these situations because it kind of pre-programs you, because it really is a sequence. So when I was talking about the conversation analysis, that kind of arose from this language method, teaching method came from that conversation analysis, where we see these set things. And then you can see set vocabulary words as well. So like, for example, if you're talking about the restaurant example, we tend to use the modal would. Right? Would you like, would you like, would you, oh no, I wouldn't. You know, so you tend to teach certain verbs that tend to go in with that, those sequence of words, or like the food items, right? So do you want soup, salad, pizza, you know, so you have different vocabulary words that you can kind of intermix in the chunk. So it's like a puzzle, and you've got different pieces that you can play with. So, oh, this is a pet peeve. Fluent speakers use production strategies like pause fillers, expressions, or repeats. So not only is this a fluent speaker strategy, it's not even a fluent speaker. Like sometimes even when people are not fluent in their L1, I would say this, honestly, I kind of disagree with this, that it's a fluency strategy. I say that it's more a turn holding strategy.
Interesting.
So when you're speaking with somebody and you're trying to formulate your idea, and maybe the vocabulary is not coming, maybe it's the syntax, maybe it's the whole thought, and you're trying to buy time, you can say, right? So you're buying time, and you're not letting the other person take the floor. They can't interrupt and take their turn, right? So we do it, but I actually would argue that it's not a sign of fluency. When you see a native speaker presenting and they're saying, it's actually a thinking strategy.
Would you say it's useful to teach these techniques to learners of a second language? Maybe not viewing it as a marker of fluency, but as a marker of taking turns and sounding more natural?
Absolutely, for sure. For both reasons. One, it's very important to teach them how to hold their turn. So if, as we said before, sometimes native speakers will dominate the conversation and not allow the non-native speakers to have their turn. So once the non-native speaker gets the turn, maybe they want to use this so they can hold their turn. Because if they are less fluent, there is a probability that somebody's going to jump in and interrupt them. And then the second point you made about them sounding more natural, yes, absolutely. It's very interesting. So if you ever notice like a French speaker speaking in English, instead of saying, they'll say, which we don't say in English, right? So there's different fillers in different languages, if you perceive that. So that can be an indication of your accent, actually, if you use the wrong filler. Not wrong, that it's the filler from your L1, not the filler from the L2. So that's important to learn. In Spanish, I think it's interesting because people will say, aha, aha. So it's like saying yes, but they just, aha, aha. And that's not my intuition to say that as a conversation strategy, but I picked it up by listening to people. So and then Portuguese, they say, or how is it? Like that. And you're saying you're saying yes, it is. It's like you're agreeing. So you're saying but in Spanish it's aha, aha, which is closer to English. But anyway, they're different in different languages. So good question. And yes, I would teach it actually at more advanced levels. Maybe not with the little kids, but with intermediate learners maybe, or even beginners, but more with teenagers and adults perhaps.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So looking at some features of fluency, we've already talked a little bit about this. It has to do with speed, and not being choppy. So the choppiness is created by the pauses. So as speech gets more fluent, the pauses get shorter and shorter. And maybe they get filled with a filler. Maybe it gets filled with a meaningful transition. So maybe you fill it with a word instead. So you're saying, that is to say, or what I mean by that. That's another time buying strategy, but you're actually using a phrase as opposed to it sounds a bit more eloquent. It sounds a little bit more like an advanced speaker as well. So it's a resource that advanced speakers can learn to use. And then there's this long run of syllables and words between pauses. So they have this connection. That's the liaison, the connection between words. Okay, so managing talk with interaction. So yeah, that's a good point, that even a monologue does not occur in a vacuum. Even a piece of writing does not occur in a vacuum, because you have an intended audience in mind. You have someone in mind who is your listener. And so even if you're giving a speech and you're the only person speaking, you're speaking to an audience. So you have them in mind. So the context is always important. We talked a lot about turn taking and holding the floor and discourse markers. There are others, by the way, yes, but so back channel device is when you're the listener and you want to show to the speaker that you understand and that you're paying attention. Then you can use devices like oh, yeah, right. So you're just using interjections, but you're using them to show that you're understanding and you're engaged in the conversation, that you're still listening. And then you have the paralinguistic feature. So that's the body language. Do people hold your gaze? Do they look into your eyes? Are they paying attention? Can you see by their facial expression whether they understood or not? Do they look bored by their body language? Are they looking away? Are they looking at their watch? Are they looking at their cell phone? Are they giving you other indications that they're not paying attention to the conversation? So that wraps up chapter 1. Let's look at chapter 2. So skills come from a knowledge base, and first language is largely intuitive. It's like the overview of this chapter. So you have the extralinguistic knowledge, which is knowledge, which is what we consider sociocultural knowledge. And that's knowing all of this about the interlocutor, about whether you should use a more formal discourse, what vocabulary would be appropriate. You wouldn't want to use slang or bad words in certain contexts, and other contexts it would be completely appropriate depending on who you're talking to. So this is all extralinguistic knowledge. The linguistic knowledge is the nuts and bolts of it. That's looking at phonology, we've already talked about. Vocabulary, you know for sure, and grammar for sure. Pragmatics, we just discussed. Discourse is this give and take. Is it a monologue? Is it a dialogue? Is it a speech? Is it for what kind of audience? Who's the intended audience? And what do you know about genre? What does that mean to you?
So genre to me means, is it a speech or a presentation? Is it an informal discussion, a formal, what form it's taking?
That's it, exactly, precisely. So all of this affects the speech, right? All of these factors, who you're speaking to, what kind of person, what group, you know, are they native speakers, non-native speakers, are they rich, are they poor, you know, all of this will affect these linguistic choices. And then the speech conditions, they might be physical in the environment or in the person. So there might be a lot of background noise. There might be a lot of interruptions from others coming. Maybe you're having a one-on-one dialogue with somebody, but somebody keeps coming in to interrupt. Or maybe you're not feeling well. Maybe you have congestion or a sore throat or something like that. So there are a lot of physical factors in the environment as well as personally that can affect the speech. Extralinguistic knowledge. This is a really interesting topic. So this is your knowledge about the topic, about the culture, the people you're speaking to, the context. Are you familiar with this topic? So that influences psychological factors of confidence. And the elliptic nature of speech, redundancy is left out. So what's an ellipsis? Do you know what that is? Hang on, you muted yourself and I can't unmute you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Is an ellipsis information that has been left out that's been previously touched upon, such as this is, that is?
Right. Yeah. An ellipsis is when you put the ... right? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so you leave something out, right? It's like to be determined, or you already know that. So just ...
Okay.
fill in the blanks. You don't need to repeat yourself because we know. And didactic language, words or expressions that make direct reference to the context. So these are words that you'll use that refer to the context of the speech. So it might not be the speech itself, but you're using other words to refer to the speech. And then the sociocultural knowledge, we talked a little bit about that before, about understanding the norms and behaviors of the interlocutor. It's the context where you are. So like, for example, in Native American cultures, silence is just normal and natural and to be respected. So if you were to go to visit somebody on a Hopi reservation or something, you're expected to drive up to their hogan, to the area where they will be staying, and you should sit in your car for a while before you even get out to get them ready for the idea of having a visitor and a conversation. And then you walk up slowly, and when you arrive, they might greet you and offer you a seat and maybe some tobacco or something to drink. But you would sit there in silence until your host decides to share in the conversation. So maybe they won't speak for quite some time. Maybe they'll just wait. And it's perfectly polite and normal and acceptable to just sit there in silence. And in most cultures, that makes people pretty nervous, and they can't feel comfortable in silence. So this is an example of social cultural knowledge. So if you're coming from a culture where silence is uncomfortable and you're meeting somebody where silence is normal, there's going to be a disconnect there, and they might not even know, and you might not even know exactly what caused the disconnect. For some reason, your rapid, fluent speech might make the person who's accustomed to silence feel very uncomfortable, and the conversation could go south just based on the fact that you were not able to develop rapport because of that. So one person's speaking really fast, filling in all the silence, all the gaps, and the other person's thinking, geez, this gal's really nervous. What the heck's going on? Why can't they just relax for a minute and enjoy the peace and, let the elders speak? So they are offended, and you don't even know. So this is the deep level of conversation. Uni had a question. She asked about the diegetic, if that includes words like this, that, these, and those. Yes, it does. That's a good example. So you're referring to context inside the conversation. So maybe it occurred previously, or maybe you're telegraphing an idea that's going to come up next. And so that idea, right, to talk about something that's going to come up next. Thank you for contributing. And if you want to throw in, oh, okay, great, thanks. Thank you, Yuni. So let's see, where were we here? All right. So going into a little bit more depth about the genre, and you listed the genres very nicely, and we can talk a little bit about genres. Genres tend to be classified into two different basic types. One is transactional, the other is interpersonal. And transactional, as the name implies, tends to be for goods and service. Like you want something, there's an objective for that conversation. So you want to buy something usually. Or you might just be information. Maybe you call somebody and you need to set an appointment. That's considered transactional. Whereas interpersonal is more for establishing relationships. So it's for making friends, for just hanging out, for chatting, to go out to dinner. But you're just talking just to make conversation. It's not necessarily because you want something out of that person. It might be just for fun. Or listening to a comedian could be another example of that. It's not really a transaction. And then you have interactive versus non-interactive. So if it's interactive, it's a dialogue, there's give and take, there's back and forth. Non-interactive would be like a speech or a monologue. It's just one person. And then you have planned versus unplanned discourse. So we talked about like a play or a speech that's written, usually actually written before it becomes a speech. So they might have prepared it and written it and memorized it, and then it becomes a speech. So there's an interplay between the written word and the spoken word. And then there's the discourse knowledge, and that's knowing how to make a conversation. So we talked a little bit about that with the sociocultural knowledge with the example of silence. But like, for example, particularly people from the United States are considered to be very direct. they'll just go straight to the point. So if they meet somebody new and they need something, they'll just ask for it. Or if they think that you're wrong, they might just tell you. And in other cultures, that might be considered very rude. So you need to kind of chat about, how's your family, how's the weather, how was your day, and then finally you get to, so I was thinking about. So there's a lot of hedging that goes on, and then finally you can get to the point, and that's considered then polite way of doing it. So this discourse knowledge is very closely connected to the sociocultural knowledge. This happens a lot in writing styles, for sure. And like you have some cultures that are more cyclical traditions. They tend to be more closely related to agrarian societies that are based on the seasons and the sun and the moon, and so their life is more cyclical, and so their speech tends to be more cyclical. So they would find this direct, straight to the point type of speech to be rude. And that will also affect their writing styles. So in the US, with this direct, straight to the point discourse style, we have the style in writing where we say, tell them what you're going to say, tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right? So you have the intro, the body, and the conclusion. And for us in the West, that's considered really good writing style. But in the East, and Uni, you can let us know if this is true or not, it's considered kind of strange to tell them what you're going to tell them at the beginning. Like, why should I ruin the surprise? We have to kind of build up to it and make the case and explain. And then at the end, we draw the conclusion and we make our final point. So it's very interesting how culture affects discourse styles, and also then therefore what we consider to be polite or impolite forms of discourse. So looking at pragmatic knowledge, we talked a little bit about that before with the body language, but that pragmatics is kind of like the paralinguistics. It's the extra additional information. It's not the actual words, it's not the discourse style, it's not the pronunciation. So it's has a lot to do with the context and where the speech is taking place. It does have to do with the speech acts, which we talked about. That was like the ordering food. So you have all these different speech acts, like complimenting or suggesting or offering. And we were talking about the language teaching theories that use that. They teach the speech acts and the chunks. And then you have the adjacency pairs, which we talked about. That has to do with the conversation analysis. So it might be like question and answer. It's the give and take in the dialogue. These are what are considered adjacency pairs. So it's turn taking. And the second utterance depends on the prior utterance. So you build upon each other. If somebody says something way off in left field that had nothing to do with what you were saying, there's a disconnect. And so either they didn't understand, or they weren't paying attention, or there's some sense of urgency. There's some need for them to bring in a disjointed adjacency pair, which is an unusual occurrence. The IRF exchange is initiate, respond, follow up. This is a real typical pattern that occurs in classrooms between teachers and students. So usually the teacher responds or initiates, and then the students respond. And then usually the teacher will follow up by making a correction or a comment. However, of course, students can initiate by asking a question of the teacher, and the teacher will respond. And maybe the student follows up with another question. So, but this type of IRF exchange is typical in classrooms. Then we can talk a little bit about the cooperative principle. The idea is that when you're in a conversation with somebody, you are cooperating with them. Like, they're there hopefully because they want to be. Of course, there are types of conversations that occur that are uncooperative, maybe a judge is questioning a defendant, or a parent is giving their child a hard time, and maybe they don't want to be in that, but nevertheless, by participating in the conversation, to some extent you're cooperating because you're participating in this exchange. So you must respond when somebody else initiates, and you should respond with something appropriate that makes sense for that context and for that initiation, for that particular question. So there's a principle of cooperation that we're building this communication and this interaction together. And this all has to do with the quantity of speech, the quality of speech, how it's done, the relation and manner. Politeness is an important factor. We talked a little bit about that before. There's an important concept in the East about saving face. And that's not a concept that's very important in the West, right? So you both know from experience. So in the West, it's kind of tough it out, and if you're wrong, you're wrong, and that's okay, and it's okay to be wrong. But in the East, if you tell an elder or a teacher or somebody that they're wrong, it can be very embarrassing for them, because traditionally they're not supposed to be wrong. So that can make teaching very difficult in these contexts, because the teacher in a hierarchical society is supposed to be the keeper of all knowledge and supposed to know everything and impart your wisdom to your students. And students are supposed to be an empty vessel that receive your wisdom from all the years, and they shouldn't question you. And so that makes the dialogue difficult. It makes the interaction very difficult. If students perceive that perhaps the teacher is wrong in that context, they're not allowed to call the teacher out on it and say something. It would cause the teacher to lose face. It would be a threat. It would be embarrassing. And then the person who called them out would also be embarrassed in that society, in that culture, because they wouldn't be behaving according to normative standards. This makes it complicated because, of course, nobody knows everything, and teachers don't know everything. And actually, really, really good teaching, we're mentors, not the sage on the stage. So we're asking questions, and we're lifelong learners, and we're continually learning. And we honestly don't know everything. So it's okay to say when you don't know and you want to look it up or get more information. Or sometimes we use a rhetorical question as a technique when we're working with students and say, well, what do you think about that? Because we're actually trying to use a technique called eliciting, because when you get the information from the student as opposed to giving it to them, they're much more likely to internalize it and remember it, because they came up with it, they made the connection. So it's much more meaningful to actually turn the question around on the student and let them answer it. Like, there are studies that show that they will retain the information better if they come up with the information. However, in a high power distance culture, which is what occurs in the East, where saving face is important. So there's a big distance in authority and power between elders and parents and teachers and students and youngsters and strangers and foreigners. Then it's difficult to use techniques like that, because in that context, the students might think that the teacher doesn't know, which would lose face. So they think, oh, he doesn't know the answer, so that's why he's throwing the question back at me. And also, it can be very complicated as a teacher in these contexts if, let's say, for example, you're teaching in a business setting and you have elder executives in your class. So maybe you're younger than the executives in your class, and they can't be seen to be wrong in front of their classmates. So they're old and they're supposed to know everything, including the language that they're just starting to study. So you're putting them in a double bind. It's kind of a complicated question. So you have to always throw them softballs and allow them to answer the question, and so that they don't lose face. And so Uni's saying, I'm sorry, but I slightly disagree with that when you say eliciting is hard to apply in Eastern classroom. Okay, great, Uni, tell me about it. Why do you disagree? And thank you for disagreeing. So you proved me wrong. I'll go on as you type, but please put in your comment. Why do you disagree? Let me move on to register, if she wants to put in her comment there. So register is really talking about different levels of politeness. And so in a formal register, it's very polite language. And in an informal register, we can use slang and bad words and incomplete sentences and neologisms and things that are considered appropriate for that type of register. Moving on to grammar, vocabulary, and phonology. So this is the meat of listening and speaking, or of all language, right? These are the content words and the structure. So for grammar, there are performance effects, like when we don't feel solid with our grammar. So maybe we hesitate, or we repeat, or we have false starts, incomplete utterances. When you're searching for the right construction in your mind. And obviously the grammar that you use in written language, it tends to be different than spoken language. In general, writing is more formal than speaking, although not always. We gave the example of a speech, which can be a very formal piece of spoken discourse. But in general, the sentence structure is different in writing versus speaking. And you tend to use different structures in the two. Vocabulary, we kind of break it down into productive versus receptive word knowledge. This is a pretty important distinction. The productive vocabulary are those words that you know how to use. Receptive vocabulary are those words that you understand. So maybe you understand the word from context, or you understand it because it's a cognate and it sounds like another word in your language, so you're able to draw a connection and understand it. But you wouldn't be able to produce it, you wouldn't be able to use it, unless you have several exposures to it, and then the receptive knowledge becomes productive knowledge. So when you hear it several times, then you feel confident, you understand the meaning, and you're able to use it. And it might be a question of trial and error. Sometimes we produce language and it's incorrect, and based on our environment, we'll get the feedback that the use was incorrect. It's either a direct correction, or they didn't understand, or from the body language we understand that they didn't understand. So then we might change our production. So it's a question of trial and error. We talked a little bit about chunks before when we talked about phrases. Collocations is another important chunk. Do you know what those are? Collocations?
Sorry, I was muted.
That's okay.
I don't remember the exact definition, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So collocations are words that usually occur together. So like ham and eggs, if you're going to order a sandwich, it's very typical to hear ham and eggs, but you would never say, I'm going to have eggs and ham. Sounds strange. And the collocations usually occur in a certain order. Or you say, it's raining cats and dogs. So it might be an idiomatic expression. It might be certain words that just happen to always come together. You have a lot of verbs that are followed by certain prepositions. So you have two different types. You have phrasal verbs. So you have things like stand up, sit down, shut up, stuff like that. It's the verb plus the preposition that has sometimes a different meaning. Like you might have something like, oh, come on, right? But that means, are you saying the truth? right? So it's a phrasal verb. You have come plus on, but it means something totally different. Or you have certain verbs that are followed by certain pronouns, like you talk to somebody, or you can talk with somebody, but you don't talk, well, you might talk for somebody in certain contexts if they're not able to. You don't talk by somebody, right? So you have certain prepositions that follow verbs, in which case it's not a phrasal verb, but it's just because that preposition is usually required after that verb. I'm going to move along a little bit faster because we've only got about 10 minutes left and I want to get through chapter 3 as well. But let's do this discussion question at the end of this page. What are the implications for teaching these 3 aspects of speaking? So what are some sample activities? Oh, actually, I think that's going to take kind of a long one. I'm going to skip that one if you don't mind. I'm sorry. We got a little behind in our examples and conversation. So speech conditions, if we're talking about the internal factors going on, you have cognitive factors, so that's the person's knowledge of the topic, their familiarity with the genre, their familiarity with the interlocutors. If you know the person, if you're familiar with them, it's easier to speak to them. Affective factors are your feelings towards the topic or the participant that can affect your ability to be productive in the conversation. And performance factors, it might be, did you have enough time to think about the topic before you had to speak about it? If you got really caught without any preparation, that totally affects your fluency because you had no time to plan for that. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as English language teachers, is allowing our students to have enough preparation time. There's some really interesting studies that show that if we give students more time to prepare before we ask them to produce, their production will be much better because they've had time to think about the topic, think about the vocabulary, think about the grammar, and then they're actually asked to put it together. So you might even give them an opportunity to practice in pairs before they need to repeat to the group, in which case their performance should be even better. So let me see if I can just kind of whiz through chapter 3 real quick. Just have, oh, that's perfect, about 10 minutes left, so we're good. So skills and knowledge from the first language doesn't always transfer to the second. That's kind of the main point of this chapter. So there are obviously differences between speaking in the L1 and L2. We've talked a lot about that. It can be affected by the social cultural setting. Communication strategies might be very different in different cultures. What the L2 speaker needs to know might be different, and their availability for use. So that has implications for teaching. We'll get into more details in a second. So frequently students don't have a lot of opportunity to practice speaking. So we were just talking about giving them more time to prepare for speaking. And frequently we're kind of rushed for time in class. So sometimes we have to cut that a little bit short. So they might not speak very well, but it might be a lack of opportunity. So it's really important for us to give them as much opportunity to speak as possible. That's why the lecture method generally isn't very good, because students don't get an opportunity to interact with the content, regardless of what it is, whether it's language or not. But you want them to have a chance to position their ideas in relation to yours. Strategic competence is what strategies to use when you're speaking. So these are different strategies that you can use to make yourself sound more fluent, although you might not actually be. Very interesting. So let's say, for example, you don't know the word of the thing that you're trying to explain. So you might use a strategy called circumlocution, which is kind of talking around the topic. So you don't know that word, but if we explain it and describe it, you can understand it. You might use word coinage, which means making a word. So sometimes you hit and you get it right. Like sometimes you make up a new word. So you know that in certain languages you add a certain suffix to create nouns. So you're not sure what the noun is, but you'll just try it and it works. And you know, if there's no reaction from the other person and you can see that it worked, all the better, and move on. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it becomes funny, sometimes it's a joke, and maybe the person will correct you, but it is a strategy for communication. So there's a lot of different strategies you can use. Code switching, switching languages, going back and forth. I think we talked about that last week. Appealing for help. I don't know, what do you call blah, blah, blah in your language? Translation, or asking, you know, pointing, showing the object. Avoidance strategies, you might just avoid that topic or avoid that word. That happens with some words that we're afraid to pronounce because we're embarrassed that we're going to say it wrong. That happens a lot with false cognates, where you're afraid you might use the one that's embarrassing, so you avoid that word and use a different word that's similar. So these strategies may contribute towards stopping in your acquisition of the second language, because you're never forced to look that word up in the dictionary and to make it part of your active vocabulary. So if you're always using some of these techniques to beat around the bush, or use, you know, not have to use that word or that situation, then it can stop you from learning. Not always. Sometimes it helps, because at least you're engaged in the conversation and talking with somebody else, and so it has that potential, but it doesn't mean that that will occur. I think that we've already talked about most of this. Let's skip over that. Okay, so talking about the 3 basic types of of knowledge that we look at in language teaching, we talk about a behavioral model. And behaviorism comes from the idea that people are kind of like animals, in that their brain is a black box and we can't see inside it, so there must be nothing going on. People just repeat what they've been exposed to. And so they use a lot of repetition in a behaviorist model. Audiolingualism is an example of a behaviorist model, where we talked earlier about the language labs, when people would listen to headphones. So that repetition is a behaviorist idea, that repetition is going to allow people to understand and be able to produce in the language. A cognitivist perspective is looking more at the person's ability to develop their own intellectual autonomy. So they're starting to use some metacognitive strategies in thinking about their thinking. So they're raising their awareness about their language that they're using. So then we teach them about these sociocultural factors and the paralinguistic factors, so that they can understand if their interlocutors understand or not, and then they can ask for clarification or use a different strategy. But we want to try and help them to think about how they produce language. And then finally, the sociocultural perspective takes the context into consideration and sees that joint construction of conversation, that we're in it together, we're building meaning, we're building understanding, we're partnering in this together to make understanding. And that has very important aspects for language, in that you're whether you're able to correct yourself or others. Let's see, Uni responded to the point that she had made earlier about saying that she disagreed that eliciting is hard to apply in the Eastern classroom. She says, I once corrected my English teacher when I was in high school, and I was not called out for any trouble. She was also free to admit her mistake. I also asked my teachers why it was this but not that. When I went to college, most of my Vietnamese professors also used eliciting when lecturing. Therefore, I think as an English teacher in the Eastern classroom or the power authority environment, we should be polite and careful, but should not be scared to use different technique. That's awesome, Uni. I'm so happy to hear that, because I feel like things are changing. I think in old school times, it really was a very hard to call out your teacher, and I'm so happy to hear that that's no longer the case, that it's changing. At least in Vietnam, we can't necessarily generalize and say that's the case in all of Asia, and not with all people, right? Maybe the older teachers are still a little bit more entrenched in saving face. Um, I brought up that story. I used to work a lot in Korea, not myself there, but I used to travel there quite a bit. I didn't teach myself in Korea, but I had a lot of Korean teachers, and I would travel there and visit them, and a lot of them were afraid to speak in English in the classroom because they felt like their students had better English than they did, and they were very ashamed of making a mistake. So I felt so sorry for them because they had a lot of knowledge, but they were afraid. So I'm really glad to hear that. That's wonderful news. It's very interesting. Okay, so all three of these behaviors, cognitive and social cultural, they all have their place. Like behaviorism is awesome for teaching pronunciation. It's really good, and it is good at the beginning levels for people to get this practice. But it can become very boring. So we do want to get to a cognitive level where people understand their own speech and their own learning. And then finally, social cultural obviously is always very important for sure.